My name is Shaheen Hirji, and I'm with Amnesty International's Palestine Action Team. I'll be your host for the next 90 minutes, and also with me are Tasneem and Elena, who will be managing the logistics and the Q&A. So once again, thank you for joining. We're very excited to have with us today 3 experts who will share with us the research and findings from various recent reports, including Amnesty International's report released in December 2024 entitled "You Feel Like You're Subhuman: Israel's Genocide Against Palestinians in Gaza." The Human Rights Watch report, also released in December 2024, entitled "Extermination and Acts of Genocide: Israel Deliberately Depriving Palestinians in Gaza of Water," and the UN Special Rapporteur's March 2024 report, titled "Anatomy of a Genocide: Report of the Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Palestinian Territory Occupied Since 1967 to the Human Rights Council." They will walk us through the research and share their findings about Israel's genocidal acts against the Palestinian population of Gaza. They will also talk about what these findings and reports mean in the context of international human rights law and the legal obligations that all states carry to prevent genocide. We should have lots of time for your questions at the end of the webinar, so please put any questions that you have in the Q&A box on Zoom. It should be at the bottom center of your screen, and we will try to get through as many as we can. We do encourage you to use the Q&A box and not the chat box for any questions, because that's what we're going to be monitoring. And we'll also be sharing some links with you in the chat shortly to the reports that we've been discussing, and some current online actions that you can participate in if you wish. So please keep an eye out for those. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I know we have people joining us today from across the country and some from around the world, and it is important for us to take a moment to think about the land that each of us are on and the traditional owners and stewards of that land. I'm currently based in Toronto, which is also known originally as Toronto, on Turtle Island in Canada. These are the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. This territory is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to look it up, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and other allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this land is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. While I'm grateful to live and work on this land, I also recognize Canada's long and painful history of colonization and oppression of Indigenous peoples. It is particularly important to bear this in mind before our discussion today, where we will be speaking about what might be viewed as the horrifying culmination of the occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people over the last 77 years. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our 3 incredible speakers for today. First up, we'll start with Hilary Holmes. Hilary is a longtime human rights activist who currently works for Amnesty International Canada as their crisis and tactical campaigner. As a young leader, they developed youth participation in leadership development programs at the national and international level before shifting to strategic campaigning. Over the years, they focused on a wide range of issues from around the world, including children affected by armed conflict, the arms trade, international justice, the human rights impact of national security measures, and mass surveillance. Welcome, Hilary. Then we will hear from Human Rights Watch. Unfortunately, Niku Jafarnia, who was supposed to originally join us today, and you would have seen her name on the posters, was unable to make it due to unavoidable circumstances. But we're very lucky today to have with us Milena Ansari. Milena is the Israel and Palestine Assistant Researcher at Human Rights Watch and was very involved in the report we are going to hear about. She monitors and reports on human rights conditions and abuses in Israel and Palestine. Over the years, Milena has gained valuable experiences working to defend human rights with leading Palestinian human rights organizations and analyzing systematic violations of prisoners' rights and children's rights under international law. In 2022, she also worked part-time as an international law lecturer at Birzeit University in Palestine. Milena is a trained Palestinian lawyer. She has a BA in law from Birzeit University and an LLM in international law and human rights from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Welcome, Milena. And our final speaker will be none other than Michael Link. Michael is Professor Emeritus of Law at Western University, where he taught labor law, constitutional law, and international human rights law. As many of you may know, he served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory between 2016 and 2022. His scholarship and his UN reports have been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada, the International Court of Justice, and the UN General Assembly. So welcome, Michael. Okay, I am now going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. Hilary, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks, Shahin. The report we released last December was certainly a landmark report for Amnesty. We, of course, found that Israel committed prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention with the specific intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza. And as such, we conclude that Israel has committed and continues to commit genocide in Gaza. As our research continues this year, we have found no evidence to suggest that Israel's policies, actions, and omissions have changed in any significant way. And it was our first ever independent finding of genocide. So I'm going to start with a few words about how the research and analysis was actually done. We took extensive field and desk research into the violations perpetrated by Israel in Gaza between October 2023 and early July 2024. That was our primary research period. We did include overarching data until early October 2024 and key international developments then until the end of December 2024. And of course, our report was released in early December 2024. And since that's not the end of our research has continued, but I'll be speaking primarily about that particular time period. So we conducted comprehensive desk research of public media statements, including those by Israeli officials and court documents. So this included an extensive collection of media reports, statements, reports, and data sets published by the UN agencies and humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza, as well as Palestinian and Israeli human rights groups. We looked at statements by senior Israeli government and military officials and other official Israeli bodies, including spokespersons of the Israeli military and the coordination of government activities in the territories, the COGAT. That's a unit within Israel's Ministry of Defense tasked with administering civilian matters in the occupied Palestinian territory. We also reviewed submissions that were made to or decisions taken by the Israeli Supreme Court, as well as the publicly available material relating to South Africa's case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. And you'll be hearing more about that specific case later. Despite repeated attempts to actually engage with Israeli authorities through information and meeting requests, we received no substantial answer to any of the letters we sent between October 2023 and October 2024. We interviewed 212 people. That included Palestinian victims and witnesses, local authorities in Gaza, healthcare workers, and representatives of NGOs and UN agencies, among others. And we analyzed quite an extensive range of visual and digital evidence. That included satellite imagery, video footage and photographs, items that were posted on social media or obtained directly by our researchers. We have a digital evidence lab, which authenticated and where possible also geolocated the video footage and photographs. We looked at Israel's acts in Gaza closely and in their totality, and we took into account their recurrence and simultaneous occurrence, both with the immediate impact and the cumulative and mutually reinforcing consequences. We looked at scale and severity of the casualties and the destruction over time. We also took into account the pre-existing context of dispossession, apartheid, and unlawful military occupation in which these acts were committed. So we could find only one reasonable conclusion, and that was Israel's intent is the physical destruction of Palestinians in Gaza, whether in parallel or as a means to achieve its military goal of destroying Hamas. And what about Hamas? So before, and the other armed groups, before reaching our conclusion, we did look at Israel's claims that it its military lawfully targeted Hamas and other armed groups throughout Gaza, and that the resulting unprecedented destruction and denial of aid were the outcome of unlawful conduct by Hamas and other armed groups, such as local fighters among the civilian population or the diversion of aid. We concluded that these claims were not credible. The presence of Hamas fighters near or within a densely populated area does not absolve Israel from its obligations to take all feasible precautions to protect civilians and avoid indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks. In fact, we found that Israel repeatedly failed to do that. We also found no evidence that the diversion of aid could explain Israel's extreme and deliberate restrictions on life-saving aid. Next slide, please. So what is genocide? Genocide is a crime under international law, whether it's committed in times of peace or armed conflict. There's no military or other possible justification for genocide. It's prohibited and criminalized under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which most people just refer to as the Genocide Convention, and Israel ratified that convention in 1950. So it's important to recognize that genocide is not simply about the scale of the violations that are happening. It's about specific actions and intent. So under Article 2, there are 5 specific acts. We found evidence of 3 of these acts occurring. That's where our findings focus on. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the three acts where we found evidence: killing members of the group. In this case, the group refers to Palestinians. And what this means in this context is that the killings must be intentional. Within the context of armed conflict, that could be direct attacks on civilians and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks, which deliberately target the civilian population. For example, you use a weapon that you know cannot be precisely controlled, or which you know has a wide pattern of destruction or effect, and it's too powerful just to impact the precise target that you intended, particularly in a densely populated residential area. So the second was causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. So this requires the infliction of harm so serious as to threaten or contribute to the physical or biological destruction of the group. The third area where we had a finding was deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So what this means is methods of destruction that don't immediately, unlike killings of the members of the group. So it's not immediately killing members of the group, but which ultimately are able to lead over time to their physical or biological destructions. In other words, this is often referred to as a slow death. There are 2 other acts under the Genocide Convention for which we did not have findings, and those are imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group or forcibly transferring children to another group. Next slide, please. So a few words about intent, because genocide is not just the sort of finding the acts in the category, it's also about intent. So in order to constitute the crime of genocide, the acts have to be committed with the intent to destroy, in part or in whole, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So there's 3 parts there: intent to destroy, in whole or in part, and a designated group. And again, the designated group here is Palestinians in Gaza. So an intent to destroy a group in part is sufficient to establish the requisite specific intent for the crime of genocide. The group doesn't then have to be destroyed in whole or in part for a finding of genocide. Intent can be found based on specific evidence, or it can be inferred, and finding a specific or inferred intent does not require finding a single or sole intent. In other words, the state's actions can have 2 goals: achieving a particular military result and destroying the group. So Israel's unlawful conduct throughout its military offensive resulted in unprecedented harm to Palestinians in Gaza. It's a massive scale of killings and serious injuries over a short period of time, unimaginable destruction. It rendered the area uninhabitable and caused, at very quick speed, malnutrition, hunger, and the outbreak of multiple diseases. Israel must have been aware of the objective probability that these conditions of life would lead to the physical destruction of Palestinians in Gaza. So it not only understood the impact of these acts, but intended their outcome. We did consider, is it simply a matter of being out of control or acting recklessly in the pursuit of Hamas and other armed groups without a specific intent, but rejected that argument. Many of Israel's actions, by definition, were quite intentional, such as the evacuation orders, cutting off aid and electricity, arrest and detention, and so on. We also looked at the dehumanization of Palestinians and statements on the destruction of Palestinians. So we examined Israeli officials' use of dehumanizing, racist, and derogatory rhetoric against Palestinians prior to the offensive. Israel's unlawful acts were often announced, called for, urged in the first place by officials in Israel's war and security cabinets who called for the destruction of Palestinians in Gaza in public and widely circulated statements. And this included statements by the Prime Minister, the then Minister of Defense, other government ministers, high-ranking military officials, and so on. That language that was used by Israeli officials was frequently repeated, including by soldiers in Gaza, apparently as a rationale for their behavior. And part of the analysis we did was of videos and audio recordings and photographs and so on that soldiers were posting. And the very sort of ease of finding these things and the proliferation of them was sort of indicative of that pattern of behavior. So next slide, please. So I'm going to go over some of our findings first about the two areas, killings and causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to the group. Our report was over 300 pages long, so I'm just going to be hitting some highlights here. So Israel used airstrikes as a primary military tactic, continues to. There were over 10,000 airstrikes between October 7th and the end of last year. And it's resulted in some of the highest death tolls among children, journalists, health and humanitarian workers of any recent conflict. So we examined 15 specific strikes in depth. This analysis is indicative of a larger pattern of repeated, both direct and indiscriminate attacks by the Israeli military. These airstrikes used large bombs to hit homes and public spaces in densely populated urban areas. They killed, these 15 strikes alone killed 334 civilians, including at least 141 children, and there were no identified military targets in any of these 15 cases. In 5 out of the 10 cases, homes were struck between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. when residents were likely to be sleeping, and 11 of the 15 attacks were carried out on overcrowded homes in Wadi Gaza, where families had relocated after an evacuation order in the north. So we saw whole families and across multiple generations destroyed. And these attacks were conducted in ways that were designed to cause a very high number of fatalities and injuries among the civilian population. So many of those 15 that we looked at were residential multi-story buildings, family homes, and so on. But one of them was an airstrike on a market shortly after October 7th. So on October 9th at around 10:30 in the morning, Israeli airstrikes hit a market in the Jafarnia refugee camp, and that's a few kilometers north of Gaza City. That airstrike killed at least 69 people and, of course, caused many more injuries. And the market street that was hit was one of the busiest commercial areas in northern Gaza. It was even busier that day because it was filled with thousands of people who had just relocated. And of course, they fled without much with them. So they were in the marketplace looking for things. Our crisis evidence lab looked at 6 videos showing the aftermath of the airstrike. You could see the densely populated area with, again, multi-story buildings. The satellite imagery showed at least 3 of those multi-story buildings completely destroyed and several structures around the area heavily damaged, as well as numerous bodies in the rubble and so on. It was quite graphic in areas. But the Israeli military, what's interesting about this one is the Israeli military said they were targeting a mosque in which Hamas members had been present when they struck the market. But they provided no evidence to substantiate that claim. And I raise this because just mere membership in a political group is not in and of itself enough to make somebody a target. But notably, the satellite imagery actually showed no mosque in the immediate vicinity, raising so many questions about the nature of this attack. The next slide, please. So some of our findings around the slow death, the deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. So by January 2024, we had seen repeated mass displacement of 90% of the population through some 59 evacuation orders. Many people were repeatedly displaced. And ultimately, these evacuation orders were really just a tool of displacement rather than protection. People were often instructed to relocate to areas that would then be subjected to new evacuation orders and which already had sort of heavy damage and destruction. So they really lacked the infrastructure for people to survive, let alone, by early 2024, we also saw that the Israeli military had started airstrikes on so-called humanitarian zones. Before the strikes, Israeli authorities would suddenly exclude areas that had been previously part of humanitarian zones by making changes on their maps, but they didn't give residents adequate prior warning. And for many people, just the system of dividing into blocks was just incomprehensible. People couldn't figure out where to go, what to do. By July 2024, around 60% of the total structures in Gaza had been damaged and destroyed. So approximately every 17 meters, if you can imagine it, it means like a building was destroyed. That included 85% of schools, and of course, over 500,000 students were missing an entire academic year. Hunger was already at a crisis point 2 months into the military offensive. And by January 2024, nearly 84% of health facilities and 57% of the water infrastructure across Gaza had sustained damage or destruction. And of course, we'll be hearing more about the water system from my colleague with Human Rights Watch. So other vital infrastructure had been damaged and destroyed. That included food production systems, homes, sanitation and hygiene infrastructure, roads, energy infrastructure. The supply of electricity into Gaza was completely cut off as part of the sort of total siege approach. And the fuel that could enter and who could use it was very tightly controlled. The impact of the massive evacuations also helped bring about the complete collapse, effectively, of the healthcare system. And the slow death also included the denial and obstruction of essential services and life-saving supplies by preventing humanitarian organizations from delivering essential services. And that pattern was repeated over and over again. The impact on young people and children is particularly significant and has been referred to kind of somewhat a diminished future due to injuries, loss of family, malnutrition, lack of basic childhood health care, including vaccinations, that kind of thing, weakened immune systems, making them much more susceptible to the diseases that were very rapidly spreading, loss of education, and just the repeated trauma of relocation and witnessing atrocities. So I'm going to end on sort of where have we seen Canada in this. We'll probably come back to a fair bit of this in the Q&A. We have seen some positive moves by Canada calling for a ceasefire, wanting to support UNRWA and the warrants from the International Criminal Court. And most recently, a joint statement with the UK and France calling on Israel to stop its military actions, allow humanitarian aid in, engage with the UN to ensure delivery of aid, and promising further concrete action should that not be met. But Canada hasn't recognized the situation as a genocide, so we are calling on Canada to recognize the situation as such, as part of its sort of urging Israel to end its military action, and in that context, end all military sales or military aid, else they risk complicity in the situation. So I could end on that note. If people have questions about sort of the nature of complicity and such, I'd be happy to answer some of them later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilary. Okay, we'll go to Milena.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for attending and for your time. And I appreciate Hilary your intervention. My part will very much be complementary to Hilary's. I'll be focusing on Human Rights Watch's report on conditions of life in the Gaza Strip, released beginning or last end of last year. I'll start off by saying, really, for more than 600 days, people in the Gaza Strip, half of whom are children, have been facing a crisis of survival. And hearing Israeli officials flaunt plans to squeeze Gaza's 2.2 million people into an even tinier area while making the rest of the land uninhabitable, coupled with systematic destruction of homes, orchid fields, schools, hospitals, and water and sanitation facilities, as well as using starvation as a weapon of war, which amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, including extermination and acts of genocide, should by now trigger duties under the Genocide Convention. Basically, Israel has transcended its military tactics to become a tool of erasure in the Gaza Strip. Next slide, please. For the Human Rights Watch report, we interviewed Palestinians in the Gaza Strip between October 2023 and September 2024. So some of the statistics and numbers might be outdated in the slides. So please do take on what I speak about, not what's on the screen. So people described the near impossibility of securing water for themselves and their families. The Gaza coastal municipalities of water employees, even doctors, healthcare professions, individuals working with UN agencies and international aid organizations in Gaza described to us how Israeli forces' actions have deprived Palestinians in the Gaza Strip of water and the devastating health impacts, including deaths. And this is what Hilary also touched upon, the slow killings, the deaths that we don't know about or we don't hear too much about. These, the numbers that we hear about, the 53,000 plus those killed, each human soul. These are mainly the reported deaths due to direct hostilities from the direct fighting, not from malnutrition, dehydration, or any possible other illnesses, which could be estimated hundreds of thousands. Our report takes on, and part of my intervention is taking a small part of Hilary's intervention, focused on what has Israeli authorities and Israeli forces done in the Gaza Strip to reach genocidal acts. Israeli authorities and forces basically cut off and later restricted water and fuel. They deliberately destroyed water and sanitation infrastructure and materials used to repair water infrastructure. They blocked the entry of critical water supplies to Gaza and attacked water repair workers and humanitarian workers. So we looked into Israel's acts with four of these that I mentioned, the points, and I'll go through some of them more in detail. And so our report concluded that Israeli authorities have intentionally inflicted on Palestinians in Gaza conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And this pattern of conduct is genocidal act as defined by the Genocide Convention and is ongoing. So the image that you're seeing in the slide now is a comparison of how much water people had access in the Gaza Strip, which is on the left side, between 2 and 9 liters per person per day. And the image on the left is what the World Health Organization, which uses widely recognized standards, has stated that people need a minimum of 15 liters of water per person per day for survival in long-term emergency situations. And this water is basically for drinking, for basic hygiene practices, and also for basic cooking needs. And according to UN Women, which is also important, pregnant and breastfeeding women should have access to an additional 7.5 liters of water per day per person. And our report, when it was released in December, we concluded from the reports of the Gaza Coastal Municipality Water Utility and UN agencies that between October 2023 and August 2024, people in Gaza, on average, had access to between 2 and 9 liters of water per day per person. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is just a visual representation to when we talk about how many liters on average does a person require for survival. This is just to show, like, for washing dishes, you will need 19 liters of water. For just using the toilet and flushing the toilet, it would take 24.6 liters of water. So this just gives you an idea, like a small shower, less than 5 minutes, how much water it would need and how much people in Gaza were surviving on. And most recently, 90% of households were struggling in the Gaza Strip with water scarcity in the first half of April, often forced to choose between whether to use water for showering, cleaning, or cooking. And this percentage has likely risen because of the Israeli authorities' almost 3 months total blockade of any humanitarian aid, medicine, food, fuel that is needed to operate desalination plants and water and sanitation facilities. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Just an idea of the Gaza Strip, which now if you see the UN recent maps, you would see that most of the Gaza Strip, almost more than 80% of the Gaza Strip, this small tiny area of land, has been under displacement orders by Israeli authorities or militarized zones that are restricted areas. And from what we see here in the map, the Mikrot pipelines, which are the pipelines that enter from Israel to the Gaza Strip directly, water pipelines, and the other are different water wells, water reservoirs, and desalination plants. And before, the current hostilities in 2023, the Gaza Strip faced high levels of water scarcity with 97% of groundwater, which is Gaza's only natural water source, being unfit for human consumption. And nowadays we're talking about 72% of water and sanitation facilities. This is 443 out of 618 assets regarding water and sanitation now fall within the Israeli militarized zones or in areas that have been placed under displacement orders. So most of the water resources in the Gaza Strip are not even accessible for the residents themselves. And these include, as I mentioned, water wells, water reservoirs, and desalination plants. Can we go to the next slide, please? So part of our documentation when we looked into Israel's acts of genocide was to review satellite imagery, photographs, videos that were captured between the beginning of the hostilities and September 2024. We're thankful that we're able to analyze satellite imagery, understanding that Israeli authorities have banned and denied access to most international organizations, some UN entities as well, investigative bodies, or even international media. So from satellite imagery alone, without being on the ground, and of course we know reality on the ground is way more harsher than we can ever imagine seeing on screens or satellite imageries. So our analysis shows extensive damage and destruction to water and sanitation infrastructure, including the apparently deliberate, systematic raising of solar panels powering 4 of Gaza's 6 wastewater treatment plants by Israeli ground forces, as well as Israeli soldiers filming themselves demolishing a key water reservoir in Rafah. So our evidence show that Israeli ground forces were full control of these areas at times where they destroyed wash infrastructure facilities, indicating that the destruction was not incidental to attacks on military objects, for example, but they were deliberate. And evidence show that troops video themselves methodologically laying and wiring up explosives inside a water reservoir in Rafah, in an area that was completely cleansed out of its residents. And these satellite images also show that the Israeli military bulldozers completely raised large solar panels powering wastewaters. As of today, 89% of water and sanitation assets have been either destroyed or partly damaged. The slides that will come now, there are three consecutive slides, will show a few of the satellite imagery. I'll just say a few lines for each image, and maybe we can look at the destruction from afar, from a distance. Next slide, please. So this is satellite imagery from May 7th, 2024, that shows damaged buildings and raised solar panels at the site of the North Gaza wastewater treatment plant. Next slide, please. This image is a photo shared by the Gaza Coastal Municipality Water Utility that shows the solar panel fields powering the central Gaza wastewater treatment plant completely destroyed. And again, emphasis, these areas were under full control of Israeli forces. There were no confrontation, no hostilities taking place. And while Israel has completely cut off electricity off the Gaza Strip, destroying and raising solar panels speaks loud to the intentions of Israeli forces. Next slide, please. This is an image analyzed from a video shared with Human Rights Watch in January 2022, January 22, 2024, which shows damage to the Gaza Coastal Municipality Water Utility warehouse, central warehouse in Khan Yunis, which was struck by Israeli forces with cases of deaths and injury, and the very expensive equipment for repairing water facilities were damaged and destroyed. Can we go to the next slide, please? When we talk about why is it important to look into as simple as this, how much water were people in Gaza getting? The simplest question to an element that is necessary for survival in any context. And we know how critical and crucial water is. It's not only about Israeli forces destroying water facilities that operate water and produce water, but it's also the silent killings, the silent deaths, the many modalities, like the Lancets estimate that the number of deaths in the Gaza Strip from the current hostilities are in the tens of thousands, with really with high confidence of the range reaching high numbers of thousands. And this is, as I mentioned, death due traumatic injury, and do not include indirect deaths due to illnesses, malnutrition. We spoke several times and repeatedly to many relevant officials in the Gaza Ministry of Health who told us that they're reporting the deaths that do come to hospitals are those ones from the direct hostilities. We spoke to doctors and nurses who told us that those deaths from malnutrition, dehydration, or any other illnesses not directly from the hostilities were in many times written on paper, to a point where, because Israeli forces destroyed the center archiving system that collects all the death toll in all the hospitals in the Gaza Strip, so at some point doctors were relying on pens and papers to report the deaths. Nowadays, 554 patients have been admitted due to severe acute malnutrition with complications. Dehydration and malnutrition undermine people's abilities to heal from wounds and diseases, leading to infections, illnesses, and even deaths. So cases of acute watery diarrhea, hepatitis A, even skin diseases, and have contributed to the spread of nearly 1 million cases of acute respiratory infections, according to World Health Organization. So the deprivation of water had more also acute impacts on infants, pregnant, and breastfeeding women, and people with disabilities. And we can only imagine in overcrowded shelters where women and girls lack privacy, safe toilets, and access to water. They are forced to adapt to coping strategies that compromise both their safety and their dignity. Can we go to the next slide, please? Understanding that my time is nearing an end, and I do want to leave more time for Q&A to and what can people do and what our countries or states and governments ought to do. Um, what you see on the screen is a quote from a doctor who we spoke to, who served in Gaza. She's a U.S. doctor who who was in Gaza in February 2025. She was saying that 2024, sorry, February 2024. We saw, and I'm quoting her, we saw babies pass every single day. All of them were under 1 year old. Majority were in their first 6 months of life. And this is just one testimony. I'd like to also recall a testimony that was recently presented before the United Nations Security Council by, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering his name, Dr. Firoz Sidwa. He is a trauma surgeon from the United States who volunteered in two medical facilities in Khan Yunis in 2024 and 2025. And I'm starting my quote of Dr. Sidwa. I cannot pretend not to have seen it, and you too cannot claim ignorance. He was emphasizing that, and I quote, the medical system has not failed. It has been systematically dismantled through a sustained military campaign that has willfully violated international humanitarian law. And I continue quoting Dr. Sidwa. Preventing genocide means refusing to normalize these atrocities. And this is something that we should all sit with. We're having a conversation, or my 11-minute, 13-minute intervention was about how much access to water people were having in Gaza. We're in 2025, we're in a century where we have to discuss amongst politicians and diplomats and scholars, and we're not leaving it to scholars alone. We're leaving it to states to decide whether something is a genocide or not, or having to have webinars and meetings for hours to discuss genocide, when the most important aim here is the survival of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, when what we need to do is prevent whatever atrocities is happening in the Gaza Strip. And this is something that the future will judge us about. And I'll leave space for Q&As to discuss state responsibilities, but I'm sure my esteemed panelists will also go through that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melina. Okay, I think we will go to Michael.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be asked to be part of this panel, and my grateful thanks to the organizers for putting this event together to address one of the darkest moments of this century. In my presentation, I'm going to address a couple of specific features about the past 20 months of Israel's genocide in Gaza. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reports of my Francesca Albanese, who's my successor as UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, and she issued two excellent reports in 2024 on genocide, which you can easily find by Googling her name. I'm going to talk about the factual natures of the genocide in Gaza, and I hope not to repeat what has so ably been presented by my two co-panelists. And I'll do a very quick general review of the legal and political obligations of states to prevent genocide from occurring and to immediately end it if it's determined to be occurring. But before getting into the heart of my presentation, I want to recall the words of Albert Camus, the French writer and Nobel laureate in literature, who once said that calling crimes by their wrong names only adds to the afflictions of the world. And even after almost 20 months of this war on Gaza, I still see the terms the Gaza conflict or the Israel-Hamas war as the standard descriptive moniker employed by most mainstream media outlets in the world. Genocide is rarely ever mentioned, and when it is, it's because the media outlets are quoting Amnesty or Human Rights Watch whenever they do quote them. Let's keep this clearly in mind. When used today to describe human carnage in Gaza, genocide is not meant as a slur or an insult. Rather, it's employed as a precise legal term with an exacting definition, as Hilary has given us. And that's what I think we should be using today whenever we consider the term. And a second important thing to keep in mind, determining that a genocide is occurring is not primarily meant to provide comfort for historians in the future so they can say with certainty that this crime of crimes has occurred with the historical record. No. The foremost reason for why we created the 1948 Genocide Convention and employ the test is to identify genocide as it is occurring now or very likely to occur in order to compel the world to use all of its resources to stop it immediately. A number of years ago, I remember in the aftermath of the genocide, Rwanda genocide in 1994, I recall reading an interview conducted around 2004 or so with Anthony Lake, who had served as President Bill Clinton's national security advisor between 1993 and 1997. As the reporting in April and May of 1994 rolled in, and it became clear that the mass killing of Rwandan Tutsis was unfolding, Lake recalled the debates at the White House as to whether or not to call it a genocide. And even though the evidence was strongly pointing in one direction, no one wanted to use the G word because it would compel them to marshal all of their resources to intervene and to end it. So instead, Lake recalled, all of the Western countries that could have and should have intervened with purpose and with force instead were, in his words, focused only on the edges of the problem. And so the genocide in Rwanda continued until almost 800,000 Rwandans were murdered. And so isn't this happening, what's happening now in Gaza? Virtually none of the states in the global north, with their extensive military, political, and economic relations with Israel, are willing to call the war on Gaza a genocide and thereby employ their considerable influence on Israel to bring up the genocide to an immediate end and to demand accountability. Instead, they are focused, in Anthony Lake's words, only on the edges of the problem, whether 20 or 200 trucks a day of humanitarian aid enters Gaza, or whether the ceasefire on the horizon might be temporary or permanent. Just a second, just pulling up the rest of my notes here. So if I can turn to Francesca Albanese's report. She, as I said, issued 2 reports in 2024 on the issue of genocide. And she, if you can now go to the next slide. And I'll actually, this has been covered. So let's go to another slide. So one of the, sorry, yes, that slide. One of the things that Francesca Albanese mentioned in her report was the significance of the decision by the International Court of Justice in January of 2024, after the genocide was only in its 3rd month, regarding the application brought by South Africa under the 1948 Genocide Convention against Israel. That was filed with the court at the end of December 2024. The court heard preliminary arguments 2 weeks later, and at the end of January 2024, it issued its interim decision. And you can see there, what the court said was, on the basis of the arguments and evidence and law that was entered into to the court by the Republic of South Africa, the court found that at least some of the rights claimed by South Africa, for which it was asking for, were plausible. In other words, South Africa had made out a plausible case of genocide. And as a result of that, the court went on to issue a number of what they call provisional orders. It did that in January, again in March, and again in May of 2024, all of which demanded that Israel comply strictly with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, and in particular, not to go ahead with its offensive that was then planned in May of 2024 in Rafah at the southern end of Gaza, and as well that it wound up stopping the continual incitement towards genocide that had been raised by Israeli military leaders, Israeli political leaders, and widespread throughout the media and Israeli journalism as well. None of those provisional orders or injunctions by the court were heeded by Israel, and certainly the most important one, to obey strictly its obligations under the Genocide Convention, and particularly with respect to not entering its military campaign into Rafah. One of the issues then raised by Francesca Albanese in her reports was the fracture point that Gaza represented with respect to international law and international politics. In this, what she is saying is that justice in the international sphere moves very slowly. And in the Middle East and in Gaza and Palestine in particular, international law is much closer to power than it is to justice. The hearings in front of the International Court of Justice are proceeding, but there won't be hearings in front of the International Court of Justice until sometime late in 2026 or early 2027, with the decision not expected till some months after the end of those hearings, well into 2027, long after this genocide has continued to devour the population in Gaza, long after the suffering, the scale of civilian suffering in Gaza has grown immense. Okay, if I can go to the next slide. So one of the important points made by Hilary in in their comments was that there are two aspects to proving genocide. One is genocidal acts, and I think that our two speakers today on this panel have gone through a number of acts committed by Israel in the course of its military campaign in Gaza, which would meet the definition of genocidal acts as defined by the Genocide Convention. The other thing that anybody claiming genocide has to prove is an intent to commit genocide. Here I've given only 4 of what are hundreds and hundreds of collected statements made by Israeli leaders. These were all made in the early months of the war. President of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, saying about Gaza, it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. The rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, you must remember what Amalek has done to you. Amalek, for those of you familiar with the Bible, will know that they were a particular tribe for whom had threatened other tribes living in ancient Palestine, and for whom the Israelites then wiped out completely, men, women, children, and as well as warriors. The then economy minister, Israel Katz, who's now the defense minister, saying humanitarian aid to Gaza, no electricity will be switch will be turned on, no water hydrant will be open, and no fuel truck will enter Gaza until the Israeli abductees are returned. No one will preach morals to us. And finally, the former defense minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant, had said, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, and everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly. Next slide. So this is the comments of my successor, Francesca Albanese, who in her first of her two reports in 2024 issued in March to the UN Human Rights Council. There you see where she said the overwhelming nature and scale of Israel's assault on Gaza and the destroying living conditions as it has inflicted proves an intent to physically destroy the Palestinians as a group. The following is a genocide against the Palestinians has been met. The killing, and this is the first three actions that are listed in the Genocide Convention: the killing of members of the group, the causing serious bodily or mental harm to the group members, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The next slide. So in terms of the destruction of Gaza, there you see it laid out. Presently, there are 54,000 Palestinians, including 17,000 children, who have died as a direct result of being physically attacked by Israel. As mentioned earlier, there are many more thousands of Palestinians, either who are under the rubbles of the destroyed homes and whose bodies have not been found and collected and named, or who are dying a slow death caused by malnutrition or by the spread of infectious diseases. 140,000 Palestinians have been injured as a result of the war over the last 20 months. Displaced, virtually all of the 2.3 million Palestinians have been displaced. This figure is from 2 months ago, which was 2.1 million. More explosives have been dropped on Gaza than on London, Dresden, and Hamburg combined during the Second World War. Most of the hospitals have completely put out of commission, most by deliberate attacks. Only 7, at last count, are still operating, and they're really operating only as primitive health clinics with very little electricity, very little fuel, very few medical personnel able to operate, and no advanced equipment to be able to address the enormous physical need for people who were being brought in with severe wounds. Most of the housing units have been destroyed in Gaza. Most today of the 2.3 million Palestinians remain at imminent risk of famine. Indeed, it was said yesterday by the United Nations that right now Gaza is the hungriest place in the world. Before October 7th, 2023, over 500 trucks of humanitarian aid were going into Gaza. Once the siege was lifted in January of 2025, it was up as many as 400 to 450 trucks a day were entering. And then at the very beginning of March, Israel declared a total siege on Gaza, and it maintained that total siege until last week, when it began to allow a trickle of trucks to go in. But during those 12 weeks, no humanitarian aid, either fuel, nor food, nor medical supplies, were allowed to go in. It's important to accept that starvation as a military tool is a war crime, both under the Rome Statute and under the Geneva Conventions. And the pictures we've seen with respect to the effects of starvation, famine, and malnutrition recall pictures from Leningrad during the Second World War, or Biafra during the war in the late 1960s in Western Africa. These are all parts of the claim with respect to genocide and the intent to destroy in whole or in part the Palestinians as a people. Next slide. So the last thing I'll say before leaving the room for questions and answers is that there is accountability under international law. There's accountability on Geneva Conventions of 1949. There's accountability under the 1998 Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. And there's accountability under the 1948 Genocide Convention. There's 4 specific duties that all other countries wind up having. And indeed, I should point out, it's these kinds of accountability duties that South Africa was acting under when it brought its application under the Genocide Convention at the very end of 2023 to the International Court of Justice. So the 4 specific duties of states are to prevent genocide from happening and to cooperate jointly in order to bring it to an end, not to recognize the situation and let it continue not to provide aid and assistance to the state that is plausibly committing genocide. And lastly, to enable the criminal punishment and accountability of those who are criminally responsible and individually responsible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Okay. And thank you to all three of you. I know this is a particularly difficult topic, and you had to get into some harrowing details, and we read them every day, but it's still, I think, difficult to talk about and to hear about. So we're at 3 o'clock. We've got half an hour, and we've got some really great questions. So I'm just going to switch to the questions that have come in. And thank you to everybody who submitted them. We'll try to get through as many as we can. And basically, Michael, Hilary, Milena, the questions are addressed to any of you or all of you. So please jump in. Okay, so interesting question here. Are there any expedited legal mechanisms, whether domestic or international, that can be used to compel Canadian authorities to comply with their obligations under international law, specifically in relation to the ICJ provisional measures and its July 2024 advisory opinion, before further irreversible harm is inflicted on the Palestinian population, including the very serious risk of forcible displacement from Gaza and the West Bank? Maybe, Michael, do you want to start, maybe?
Sure. Let me just start. Let me just talk about what states are obliged to do.
Yeah.
And then I think maybe others can chime in with what legal action could be taken to force them to do. But among the items that states are obliged to do when confronting serious war crimes and atrocities, but certainly a genocide, first of all, a complete arms embargo. Israel would not have been able to continue its military campaign for any longer than a few weeks in Gaza had other states not continued to supply it with arms. I'm talking particularly about the United States, which has supplied about 70% of the arms to Israel, and Germany, which supplies somewhere around 28% of the arms going to Germany, to Israel as well. But other states have important roles as well. Canada did say it stopped renewing any military contracts it had directly with Israel, but a lot of our military contracts are through American subsidiaries existing and manufacturing military parts here in Canada. Those parts continue to be manufactured, shipped to the United States, where they were assembled into completed military equipment and then onto Israel. Other things that states should be doing is supporting fully the work of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. As we know, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants in November of 2024 against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, and Yoav Gallant, the former Defense Minister. Among other things, one of the terms of indictment was the use of starvation as a weapon of war against the Palestinian civilian population. We have to be able to say that we're willing to arrest anybody for whom an arrest warrant is issued. We have to be able to use an underutilized tool, universal jurisdiction. We in Canada have incorporated the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court into our domestic legislation 25 years ago as the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. We have the full power to use our War Crimes Unit federally, which is part of the Ministry of Justice, to be able to investigate and, if necessary, lay war crimes charges or genocide charges against soldiers who have participated in the IDF, who are on Canadian soil, or against organizations or charities that are supplying the settlements in Israel or supplying finances to the Israeli Defense Forces. We should be suspending our free trade agreement with Israel until it complies with international law and brings itself back on the right side with respect to this. And we should be looking to suspend Israel from its membership in the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which we're also a member, and we have to consider whether Israel deserves continuing membership in the United Nations. Back in 1980, in Resolution 476 that was adopted by the Security Council in June of 1980. The Security Council said that it was that the prolonged occupation of Israel over the occupied Palestinian territory, at that time only 13 years long, was long overdue. It must be brought to an end. And there was a specific mention in the resolution that Israel was in violation of numerous Security Council resolutions, and it had to end its non-cooperation. Here we are, 45 years later. Israel is in violation of hundreds of UN Security Council, General Assembly, and Human Rights Council resolutions. These are far more than the resolutions that apartheid South Africa was in defiance of when it lost its credentials to sit in the United Nations back in the fall of 1974. Israel has paid virtually no cost at all for either maintaining its 58-year-old occupation, for maintaining the exclusion of the Palestinian refugees who fled or were expelled in 1948, and certainly for its almost 20 months now of this war of genocide with respect to this. Unless and until Israel feels the full brunt of diplomatic, economic, and political sanctions against it and pays a significant price for that, is there any hope of Israel ending its violations and being brought back on the right side of international law?
Okay. Thank you, Michael. That's an exhaustive list, or maybe not an exhaustive list, but that is a list of things that the Canadian government is currently not doing at all, as far as we can see. Milena?
Thank you. And I almost wanted to lower my hands because Professor Michael Link basically summed up exactly what the responsibilities of states as clear as simple. So I'm sorry if I might repeat a bit, but I 100% echo exactly the lists and duties obligated by states. But just wanted to add towards the end an additional thought to keep in mind, as well as a Palestinian myself. You know, Professor Michael Link exactly said that there has been 3 ICJ provisional measures in the case of South Africa versus Israel under the Genocide Convention, and Israeli authorities have flouted all of them. So this is a wake-up call, and this is a notice to look into the duties and obligations under the Genocide Convention. And when I say that, it's for the 153 states that are parties to it. They have the duty to prevent genocide as soon as a state learns, or should normally have learned, of a serious risk that genocide may be committed. So again, emphasis to what Professor Michael Link said, a definitive determination that genocide is already underway is not required. So states need to not just punish it, but also prevent it. Again, continued weapons sales, military assistance, even diplomatic support to the Israeli government, despite overwhelming evidence of atrocity crimes, also exposes governments themselves, including Canada and its officials, to the risk of complicity. When we talk about the ICC, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is an ICC fugitive. States have a responsibility to execute the arrest warrants, not show who can invite the Prime Minister of Israel faster, in clear defiance of the ICC arrest warrants. And this is just double standards and hypocrisy to a whole different level when the ICC issues arrest warrants against Putin or other leaders in different cases under its mandate. So again, it just shows as well for Palestinians and for the other part of the world that the Canadian or US or Western hypocrisy of human rights and really understanding justice and accountability as a mechanism to lasting security and peace is just hypocrisy and double standards. So this is something that everyone should be pushing their elected officials on. And the point I wanted to add that is different is the question a bit triggered me. Like when we talk about, expedited and quick and easy measures to do. But for Palestinians, it's not only about the genocide that started since Israel's military assault on Gaza on October 2023. We're talking about a treatment of the Palestinian people for decades decades of apartheid and persecution, of systematic discrimination and racial discrimination. So even when we talk about ending the genocide, saving lives right now, we do need to address root causes. We do need to look at how Israel treats Palestinians and the crime against humanity of persecution and apartheid. Why I mention this? Because while we talk about what mechanisms we need to seek, we also have in our hands tools and methods from the International Court of Justice, which was its latest advisory opinion in July 2024, that looked into Israel's occupation, that had clear obligations to third states with regards to, for example, not acknowledging or normalizing Israel's occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory. States like Canada, they're so proud to say two-state solution, and settlements are bad to peace and blah blah blah. But has there been any actual moves to ban trade with settlements? Has there been any sanctions, clear sanctions, not on a few bad apples, but settler entities that build upon, the apartheid nature that the state of Israel is implementing? So really, I do a little bit flinch when I hear expedited, because it makes me wonder, do we understand that the root causes, as long as we don't address Israel's long-standing impunity of their treatment of Palestinians from the river to the sea, we will not be able to find any just or lasting peace like our officials like to sing about?
A very powerful point. Hilary, did you want to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, Elena covered what I was going to say about the ICJ opinion on the occupation. The question sort of started with asking about legal, are there expedited measures? And just, I mean, there's a court case in Canada, there's a court case in several other countries around the arms transfers, but it's an incredibly slow process. If you're looking for sort of expedited measures there, they don't exist. People very early on tried to bring a number of court cases, and just like South Africa's case at the ICJ, these things take years. And obviously, action needs to happen a lot more quickly. So I did want to come back a little bit to the issue of complicity. We've been campaigning a lot on the arms trade, because continuing to do those arms transfers, and Canada took some measures, but is continuing to do other transfers. Sort of no new permits, but a number of permits are still open, and transfers are continuing. And states are obligated to prevent genocide, but they're also obligated not to aid and abet. So continuing these transfers, you risk complicity. And I think people get kind of knotted up in language around this. And I wanted to be clear that to aid and abet, you don't have to share the genocidal intent. I think that's a very important point. All that's really required is knowledge that Israel harbors that genocidal intent, and knowing that the arms transfers are aiding and assisting in the commission of that genocide. And it's not like a lot of people say, oh, Canada's arms sales, they're not very big. So yeah, they're not as big as the US, but they are contributing significantly. Canada produces some components that are unique in the F-35 system. It produces artillery, propellants, again, then that's shipped through the loophole through the US. And so it's like, again, it's not necessarily the scale. The context is very important. Thanks.
Thank you, Hilary. I just wanted to point out, I know that there's a few people have raised their hands. We can see that people have raised their hands, but unfortunately, just because of the way that the Zoom webinar is set up, we can't hear you, or the only way that we can actually see your questions is if you put them into the Q&A. So for those who have raised their hands, apologies that we can't answer your questions sort of directly like that, but if you want to put them into the Q&A, then we'll try to get to them. So there was another question, which is very sort of related to what to the point that you were just making, Hilary, and sort of related to the previous question. And so, and I'm wondering if there's any additional things that you might be able to share. So the question is, what are the legal criteria under international law for determining whether a state is complicit in the crime of genocide committed by Israel and forced displacement committed by Israel in Gaza and the West Bank? Based on these criteria, to what extent could Canada be considered complicit in Israel's actions? Have any legal actions been initiated against the government of Canada, and what is the current status of these proceedings? Can Canadian leaders, both former and current, be held criminally accountable? So, Hilary, I know you just mentioned there is a case about the arms transfers from Canada to Israel. Are there any? Do any of you know if there's any other cases? And I guess, you know, at this point, I guess I'll also raise the fact that recently, about 2 weeks ago, the government of Canada, along with the government of the UK and France, made a statement, which is probably the most strongly worded statement that they've made so far. And they talked about, taking concrete measures, but in the last 2 weeks, we haven't heard anything further about these concrete measures, and they haven't talked about when. And so I guess the question is, oh, I see Michael's got your hand up. Um, at what point are they liable? Like making statements like this, does that protect them? Is that what they're trying to do right now, is limit liability? And, at what point can they be held liable, and who can be held liable, I guess?
Well, I'll give a short answer. Internationally, there's a case being brought by Nicaragua against Germany with respect to complicity. The thrust of the Nicaraguan case at the International Court of Justice, again, under the Genocide Convention, is pointing to Article 3 of the convention, which says, you're guilty of genocide if you incite, if you actually commit genocide, but also if you are complicit in genocide as well. And the core of the Nicaraguan case is that, as I'd mentioned before, Germany is the second largest arms supplier to Israel. Again, I think it's going to take months, if not and years, for that case to unwind. But that's one of the first cases that I know at the international level where this specific question has to do with being complicit in genocide. Related to this, though, is a case that has been brought by a Washington-based organization called DAWN, Democracy in the Arab World Now. And they've concluded that they wouldn't have much success in trying to bring a complaint of complicity in genocide in the American courts. So they've actually filed a complaint with the courts in The Hague, specifically directed towards the officials in the Biden administration for what they say is their complicity. And if you wanted to find out more about this, and the documentation they provided with respect to the statements and actions during the first 14 months of the genocide by the Biden administration, both in giving military aid, but also giving diplomatic and political cover to Israel as well, is well laid out on the DAWN website. You can find that really quite easily.
Yeah, thank you. Melina?
Thank you. I did want to mention that there are many, not many, but like a few ongoing domestic cases that are being led by human rights organization. I'll recall one where Al-Haq, a Palestinian human rights organization, along with GLAN, is raising a case against the UK government under its duty to prevent genocide before a UK divisional court concerning licensing of military equipment used by Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip. And Amnesty as well, Oxfam, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have intervened in this case. And this is something really important to understand, that there are fights, whether it's international courts or domestic courts. There is a clear responsibility under the law, which we can use. Al-Haq has started and initiated a case in the UK, but this also follows a case in the Netherlands as well. And I believe a similar case is in the works in Canada. So really, these are some of the examples where a movement is necessary and needed to hold our own officials accountable.
And I would imagine that over the next few years, there will be many more cases, and they will be more organized.
Sorry, Shaheen, really, really sorry. I just remembered another quick point. Something to keep in mind, because I read this question in the Q&A about media silence and media complicity. We really ought to flag or emphasize that even news agencies and media agencies could be held accountable for any silence or disinformation or misinformation during a context of mass atrocities. So this is something that is also good to keep in mind, and is definitely something to pursue.
Well, along those lines, there's also quite a few questions sort of about citizens of Canada, and what their personal liabilities, or what they could be held responsible for. So one of the questions is, if a citizen of Canada is investing in Israeli weapons, can they be charged under the war crimes law? And is anyone globally pursuing this course of action? And are there any examples of weapons investors being charged and or convicted?
I may start off. We do have, as I mentioned before, a war crimes program and a war crimes unit based within the Department of Justice federally, and it operates as a prosecutor's office should, on an arm's length basis. However, I'm not aware of any action or any detailed investigations that have been initiated or conducted by the war crimes program with respect to this. And I know that I think the war crimes program did issue a statement within a couple of weeks of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine back in early 2022 with respect to its opening up a file and starting an investigation regarding, I guess, Russian officials who might be on Canadian soil, who could be charged under our universal jurisdiction authority. But I'm not aware of them opening up a file and initiating any investigations with respect to links between Canadian charities, Canadian corporations, Canadian individuals, and the ongoing occupation and the specific genocide going on in Gaza.
Hilary?
Yeah, it's. I mean, the parallels of how different conflicts are approached, that could be a whole webinar in and of itself. I think this raises, interesting questions about the role of companies. When it comes to the arms trade, a lot of the focus is on whether, because in order to do an export, you need unless you're doing it through the U.S. in that sort of how deeply enmeshed the U.S. and Canadian arms industries are. There's like a big loophole there. But if you're selling directly to other countries, you need an export permit. And so much of the discourse is about, should the government grant those permits or not? Have they properly assessed risks and so on? But there is an emerging discussion about the roles and responsibilities of companies and, their own due diligence in this context. Is it, and I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes, particularly in this context. It raises very serious questions about why you are attempting to manufacture things that will be used in an ongoing genocide. And you can try to hide behind, well, I had a government, like I had an official export permit to do this. It's all fine. But, at the beginning of Michael's comments, he said, it's very important to use the right label for the context. And so when there is all of the mounting evidence of what that context is, I think you need to look at corporate responsibilities through that lens specifically.
Thank you. I mean, there's so related to that, there's also, similar questions about Canadian citizens who have been involved, who have, served in the IDF and come back. There's also questions about, people who are involved, and this would be companies and individuals, Canadians who are involved in illegal land sales in the West Bank, which we've seen kind of in the news. There's been events that have been just openly, advertised. So, what are the legal mechanisms, and do we just have to rely on the government to sort of prosecute people who are involved in these illegal activities, or are there things that kind of we can do through civil society or?
If I can say, law isn't only for lawyers. What we need in particular, which I think this webinar is an important step forward, is the push from below. You know, I think our elected officials and our public legal authorities are not going to do very much on this unless they're actually forced to do this. And that's why I think, among other things, it's important to focus on the Minister of Foreign Affairs, on the Minister of Justice, and on the War Crimes Program, to be able to submit something detailed, solid, responsible evidence to them, for which they have no choice but to pursue in terms of investigation and wind up proceeding. You know, if this can be done in other countries, and this can be done in terms of the courts in the Netherlands and in the United Kingdom, this can surely be done in Canada. Canada likes to think of itself, and this government likes to think of itself as the country and the party of international law. There is no ability, there's no right to own, if you like, that honor unless you see what is happening in Gaza and Palestine and act upon it. We've passed all the necessary laws. We have put the Geneva Conventions into Canadian law back in 1958. We put the Rome Statute into Canadian domestic law in 1998. We have the legal tools for accountability. All we need now is, and we don't need to wait for our leaders to decide, because I don't think they'll decide to do anything on this unless they're actually pushed. It needs to be pushed from below, and what we're doing today, I think, is an important contribution towards understanding that.
Hilary, did you want to add?
Sorry, you end up jotting notes and then, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to recognize, like, the International Criminal Court it does focus on the sort of top leadership responsibility. So, you know, where the accountability is then sort of lower down the chain can be in a variety of places. You know, it's probably not going to be at the International Criminal Court or a similar tribunal, though. There have been a number of contexts where special tribunals were set up that were sort of, you know, joint ventures among nations to look at criminal responsibility kind of lower down in the ranks. We don't know if that's in the future right now, but those kind of options need to be considered, as well as the kind of structural investigation that, you know, Canada started one for Ukraine. They haven't started one for Gaza, to our knowledge. But the other thing I'd like to say is that we do need to remember that the IDF is, you know, it's a conscription context. So mere participation should not be equated automatically with being guilty of a genocidal act. There needs to be specific evidence collected against individuals. But in order to do those investigations, you have to put resources behind it. So it's a discussion to be had for sure, because right now those kind of resources don't exist in a country like Canada. You know, under universal jurisdiction, we've only seen a couple of cases over the years. And, you know, the government has generally said, you know, this is just, it's too expensive, it's too labor intensive, it's very hard to get witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the other thing I'd end on is it's very tempting to say, you know, our government, you know, what can Canada do? What can Canada do? But it's a collective responsibility in these situations. States need to be working together in order to achieve justice in this context. You know, one state's not going to achieve it. You know, so South Africa puts forward a case at the ICJ. Other states need to back that. They can't just sit back and say, well, South Africa has the lead on that. Good for them. Let's see where that goes. They also have to be joining in these efforts.
Point. Thank you. It looks like we are running out of time. And I wanted to thank you first for, well, first of all, thank everybody for the great questions. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your knowledge, the three of you, and for I think the rich discussion, and, you know, for your honesty and your candor and being direct, because I think it's time to be direct. Maybe before we close, if I can just go around the table, if you have any last words, maybe the final question, and this is a question that I hear a lot from people, is what can we do, right? So all these people who are on, it looks like we've got about 181 people right now, but we had over 240 at one point. Everybody here wants to know, what can we do? So maybe if we can go around the table, if you've got any sort of advice, who wants to start? Hilary?
Yeah, I can start. I think that it's such an important thing to talk about it. I think for such a long time, people were extremely hesitant to talk about the decades of apartheid, occupation, dispossession that has taken place in the occupied territories. They kind of bought into this narrative of it's terribly complex, and if you don't understand every single item of it, you can't talk about it. And I think that really disempowers people to confront serious human rights violations, let alone a genocide. So, speaking up, not sort of thinking, well, I'll be polite and won't talk about it in this context when the topic comes up. Or I know people are often very worried about being labeled anti-Semitic and so on. But really to break through that, because we're talking about the violations that are happening by a state. And to recognize that and not be afraid to be in those conversations, not be afraid to make the occasional mistake as they have those discussions, not to be afraid to kind of change how they talk about things. And, importantly, talk to your members of parliament, talk to other officials. They have a responsibility to listen to their constituents. And that is how you push and change government policy. That's what we've been doing since the start. And we finally saw Canada back the call for a ceasefire. We finally saw action on not stopping all arms sales, but limiting them. And now we're seeing, again, sort of joint statements. We need to push those into the concrete actions that they're promising. So raise your voices, be there in solidarity, and don't buy into the complexity arguments. Keep at it.
Thank you. Michael?
Sure. A lot of you who are on this call today, this webinar, belong to churches or to trade unions or your university faculty or your students at universities or community colleges. Raise the issues there. These are all important civic institutions, all of whom have taken part in raising issues with respect to Israel and Palestine. Virtually every church in the country, every mosque in the country has taken a position with respect to supporting Palestinian rights. It's the same thing true with many trade unions across the country. And at universities across the country, there are always events going on with respect to that. Participate in the events when you see them being advertised, or join with others in organizing events. In every city across the country, there are people who are skilled and knowledgeable and committed and principled with respect to issues involving Israel and Palestine. Educate all the people around you and use those kind of events to demand action. Encourage people to write letters to the editor. Encourage people to write letters to your members of parliament. They actually respond to those when they see them coming in. And I know that even this Liberal caucus has got many more members who are committed to issues of being at least open on Israel and Palestine. So all of these, I think, are tools that belong to us as citizens to do.
Thank you, Michael. And Melina?
Thank you. I intentionally let both of the panelists go before, because this question, at the end, like, what can we do, is always tough to answer, because But thankfully, Hilary and Professor Michael really touched upon the quick and easy asks to do. But the thing is, it's whatever you can do in whatever capacity you are in, do it. Now is the time, and a long time ago has passed. What I mean by this, like if you're an educator, raise awareness about Palestine. If you're a doctor, collect other doctors and look into medical complicity, for example. How can you as a doctor support, whether it's to serve in Gaza, but with access is difficult, but like to write petitions, unionize, organize. But basically the main thing is to learn and educate yourself about what's happening, because that's the most important thing before talking about Palestine and before raising your voice. And not from media or general media. No, reach out to Palestinians, reach out to Palestinian human rights organizations who are at the forefront of documenting and archiving and living exactly what they're documenting. Stay updated and follow Palestinian journalists as well. This is important. So when you speak up to the reality and not what is fed to the media. And what Hilary and Professor Michael Link has, and we've repeated over and over on this call, is to put pressure on your elected officials. And you know what my added value to this answer would be, because I haven't added any value so far, is again the Palestinian part of it. You know, as cheesy as it sounds, when we say no matter how small you think your support is, it's really a contribution. It still matters, and it does make a difference. I genuinely believe this, and to genuinely tell you, as a Palestinian, you know, when we see protests in the streets of thousands raising a Palestinian flag, when we ourselves can't easily raise a Palestinian flag in Jerusalem without being detained and arrested, we understand that people are speaking up and people are being aware. Not because, you know, the liberation of Palestine or the end of occupation or apartheid will come from internationals. It will come from Palestinians for sure. But we need your support in order to remove the complicity of your own governments, of your own countries in this fight that Palestinians are fighting. And really, like, this is not for Palestinians. I'm not advocating solely for Palestinians. I'm advocating so our humanity is not lost, so we don't see children and babies dying on a daily basis and normalize it as if it's fine, as if starving a whole nation is a military tactic. So it's about our collective awareness and humanity more about anything else.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those powerful words, Melina. I promised I wasn't going to get emotional, and it's hard not to. So we are a little bit over time, but I thank you all, everyone who stayed on, and thank you so much to Michael, to Hilary, to Melina. Also, thank you to Tasneem and Elena for keeping everything flowing smoothly. I guess I will just add that there are some actions that have been shared with you today. They're, you know, mainly petitions and things like that, and links to the reports. You can find more at amnesty.ca at the website. And if you're looking for ways to get involved, you know, all of those suggestions that Michael, Hilary, and Melina have suggested. But if you really kind of, you know, have questions on how to get involved and things you can do, when you registered for the webinar, there was an email address for the Palestine Action Team in there if you had questions. So feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to be involved in that way, or for suggestions. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. And you know, thank you for caring about human rights. And I just wanted to sort of close with a quote that we've probably all heard a million times, but it seems very important to keep in mind now. But in the words of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., once famously said, "No one is free until we're all free." So let's keep that in mind. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.